The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over Brookstone Estates, a well-manicured enclave in Columbus, Ohio, where every lawn was trimmed to perfection, every driveway gleamed with fresh sealant, and the sidewalks were smooth, untouched by time. The neighborhood exuded a serene, almost eerie stillness, punctuated only by the distant bark of a dog or the low purr of a passing luxury car. 16-year-old Elijah Brooks adjusted the strap of his gym bag as he walked, his headphones blasting music that shielded him from the quiet around him. He had just finished an intense basketball practice at Franklin High, and exhaustion weighed on his every step. Normally, he would have taken the bus home, but today, he decided to cut through Brookstone Estates. It wasn't unfamiliar territory. His best friend lived just a few blocks away. But he was also keenly aware that this wasn't a neighborhood where people expected to see someone like him walking alone. Behind the large bay window of one of those immaculate homes, Linda Cartwright stood watching. For 15 years she had lived in Brookstone Estates, memorizing every car, every neighbor, every routine. But now, something felt off. A young black teenager, tall and athletic, was walking alone down her street, a bag slung over his shoulder. A flicker of unease stirred in her chest. Was it concern, or was it something else? Her hand hovered over her phone. Maybe he was just passing through. Maybe he had every right to be here. But the unease clawed at her, whispering doubts that took root far too quickly. What if he wasn't just walking? What if she ignored her instincts only to hear about a break-in later that night? A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. It was better to be safe than sorry. With a deep breath, she pressed the numbers. 911, what's your emergency? Linda's fingers gripped the phone a little too tightly as she watched Elijah move. Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious person in my neighborhood. But Linda had no idea who Elijah really was, and she certainly didn't know who his mother was. Her voice was steady, but her pulse quickened as she continued. He's walking down my street, looking around like he's checking out houses. I don't know who he is, and he's carrying a bag. The dispatcher remained calm. Can you describe him? Linda swallowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. He's tall, black, wearing a hoodie, gym shorts. And he has a bag. I don't know. Something just doesn't feel right. The dispatcher's voice remained even. Has he done anything illegal? Linda hesitated. Well, no, not exactly. But this is a quiet neighborhood, and I've never seen him before. That was enough. The dispatcher assured her that officers were on their way, and somewhere down the street, oblivious to the call that had just been made, Elijah kept walking, unaware that, in this moment, suspicion weighed heavier than truth. Linda ended the call but didn't move from the window. Her eyes remained fixed on the boy outside. Elijah had paused, scrolling through his phone to switch his playlist, completely unaware of what was coming. A few streets away, Officers Bennett and Rodriguez sat in their squad car, the radio crackling to life with a call. Possible prowler, Brookstone Estates, male, black, mid-teens, carrying a bag. Bennett, a seasoned officer with 15 years on the force, exchanged a glance with Rodriguez, who was still relatively new, still learning how things worked. Let's check it out, Bennett said, reaching for the siren switch. With that, the red and blue lights flicked on, and the car accelerated toward the neighborhood. Elijah was only 2 blocks from home when he heard it, a piercing police siren cutting through the quiet evening air. His body tensed as he turned around, confusion flashing across his face, just as the squad car screeched to a stop beside him. The doors flew open. Hey! Stop right there! The command was sharp, leaving no room for hesitation. Elijah's heart pounded as he yanked his headphones from his ears. 2 officers stepped out, their hands hovering near their holsters. The air felt different now, charged, dangerous. What's in the bag? Bennett demanded, his voice clipped. Elijah blinked, his pulse drumming in his ears. My basketball gear, he answered, keeping his voice even, steady, careful. Where you headed? Home. The word barely left his lips before Officer Rodriguez stepped closer, his expression unreadable. You live here? Yes, sir, a few blocks over. Bennett scoffed, his skepticism thick in the air. "That right? What's the address?" Elijah parted his lips to answer, but before he could get a word out, Rodriguez grabbed his bag. "Hey, that's my stuff," Elijah protested, instinctively reaching forward. "Relax," Bennett muttered, already unzipping the bag. His hands rummaged through its contents, a pair of sneakers, a sweaty jersey, a water bottle. Nothing more, nothing less. Yet the search didn't end there. "Why'd you cut through this neighborhood?" Elijah's breath came faster now, his chest tightening. "It's just a shortcut. I'm not doing anything wrong." Rodriguez hesitated, glancing at Bennett. Maybe he's telling the truth. But Bennett didn't let up. His eyes remained sharp, his tone unwavering. "Then why'd someone call the cops on him?" Elijah's throat went dry. He opened his mouth to answer, to explain, to justify his own existence. But then he saw it. Over the officer's shoulders, a sleek black SUV approached, its engine humming low and controlled. It didn't roll to a stop. It arrived, with intention, with authority. The doors opened, and a woman stepped out. Denise Brooks, the mayor of Columbus. The shift in the air was immediate, almost tangible. Denise didn't rush. She didn't stumble. She walked with the kind of purpose that came from years of stepping into rooms filled with doubt and commanding them anyway. She wore a sharp navy blazer, her heels clicking against the pavement in measured, deliberate strides. Her expression was unreadable, but her presence alone was enough to make both officers straighten instinctively. Bennett's face tightened as recognition flickered in his eyes. He had seen her before, on the news, at city meetings. But for a moment, his brain struggled to reconcile the woman before him with the boy standing between them. This wasn't just any mother, and they weren't just stopping any teenager. Rodriguez was the first to speak, his voice firm but cautious. "Ma'am, I need you to step back. We're handling a situation." Denise didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she tilted her head ever so slightly, her expression unreadable. "Oh, I can see that," she said, her voice smooth but edged with steel. "And what exactly is the situation?" Elijah let out a slow breath, relief washing over him like a wave. "Mom." She held up a hand, a silent but unmistakable message. "I've got this." Bennett cleared his throat, suddenly feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "We received a call about a suspicious person in the area." Denise arched a single brow, unimpressed. "Suspicious?" Rodriguez gestured toward Elijah. "We stopped him to ask some questions. We needed to confirm if he actually lives here." Denise inhaled deeply, then, with deliberate precision, pulled out her phone. A few taps later, she turned the screen toward them. "That's my son." On the screen was Elijah's student ID, their home address, a photo of the two of them at a community event just last month. Evidence. Proof. Silence hung thick in the air. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. Bennett's jaw tensed, but Denise wasn't finished. "So, tell me." Her voice was calm, measured, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. "Did you stop him because he was actually suspicious? Or because someone assumed he didn't belong?" Neither officer answered. Behind them, Linda Cartwright stood frozen in her doorway, watching the scene unfold, dread curling in her stomach like smoke. The moment Denise had stepped out of that SUV, Linda knew. She had recognized her instantly, the mayor of Columbus, the woman whose son she had just called the police on. The realization crashed into her like a tidal wave. She had called the police on a kid who was just walking home. Now she stood there helplessly, watching a mother, one of the most powerful women in the city, confront two officers who suddenly had nothing to say. But just because they had fallen silent didn't mean Denise was done speaking. She took a slow step forward, her eyes locking onto the officers, her presence alone making the air feel heavier, charged like the moment before a storm. No yelling, no anger. She didn't need to raise her voice. "You searched his bag." Her tone was steady, precise, each word landing like a hammer. "You questioned where he lived." A pause. "You assumed he didn't belong?" Bennett squared his shoulders, his face unreadable. We were just following procedure. Denise tilted her head slightly, studying him. Procedure? Rodriguez cleared his throat. We got a call about a suspicious person. Denise took another step forward. A teenage boy, walking home. The weight of her words was unbearable. Neither officer had an answer, because there wasn't one. Elijah shifted, rubbing his hands together, the sting of the moment settling deep in his chest. Denise turned then, her gaze finally landing on Linda, who was still standing in the doorway. Was it you? Linda's breath hitched. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The weight of what she had done crushed her. She hadn't meant for this to happen. She didn't think it would go this far. She wasn't racist, she told herself. She was just being cautious. But now, she stood face to face with a mother who had been forced to drop everything, leave her job, rush into her own neighborhood, just to protect her son from a situation that never should have happened in the first place. Linda's face burned with shame. She swallowed hard. I just thought... Denise didn't let her finish. You thought what? The question hung in the air, heavy and damning. Linda had no answer, at least not one that wouldn't make her sound exactly like the kind of person she never wanted to believe she was. Denise's gaze didn't waver. Do you know what could have happened here? Linda looked down. She didn't want to think about it, but she knew. Elijah, this boy, this child, could have been tackled, arrested, thrown against the hood of a police car for resisting, or worse. And all because a woman who had lived in the same house for 15 years decided that the sight of a black teenager with a gym bag was enough reason to pick up the phone. Denise didn't need to spell it out. Linda already knew. The officers knew too. But instead of an apology, Bennett straightened his stance. If there's no issue here, we'll be on our way. Denise exhaled sharply, her lips pressing into a thin line. That's it? Rodriguez hesitated, glancing at his partner. Look, we were just responding to a call. Denise let out a small, bitter laugh, one without humor. Yeah, you were. She turned to Elijah then, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, her grip firm, grounding him. Come on, baby. Let's go home. Elijah adjusted his bag and followed his mother to the SUV, his chest still tight, his mind still racing. And as they pulled away, leaving behind the quiet, perfect streets of Brookstone Estates, Linda Cartwright stood motionless in her doorway, her stomach twisted in knots, knowing she would never forget this moment. And knowing she shouldn't. The officers walked back to their squad car, their voices low, muttering under their breath. Frustration, embarrassment. Neither mattered. They climbed in, shut the doors, and drove off, red and blue lights flickering faintly against the pavement before fading into the night. Linda remained where she stood, arms wrapped tightly around herself as if bracing against a cold only she could feel. She watched them disappear down the street, but the weight in her chest remained. For Elijah, for Denise, for every black family that has had to explain, again and again, why they belong in spaces that should never have been questioned in the first place. This wasn't over. The ride home was silent. Elijah sat in the passenger seat, his face turned toward the window, but he wasn't seeing the streets blur past. He was trapped in the moment that had just unfolded. The flashing lights, the grip on his bag, the way they had searched through it, through him as if he were a criminal, as if his presence in that neighborhood was something that needed to be justified, as if he weren't supposed to be there at all. Denise's hands tightened around the steering wheel, her knuckles pale from the pressure. She had known this day would come. She had always known. She just hadn't expected it to happen so soon. After a few minutes, she broke the silence. You okay? Elijah exhaled slowly, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. I don't know. She nodded, swallowing hard. I get it. He turned to her then, his eyes searching hers for something. Reassurance, maybe. A truth he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. What would have happened if you weren't there? Denise's stomach twisted into a painful knot. There were so many answers to that question, and not a single one she wanted to say out loud. Instead, she reached over, took his hand, and squeezed. You did everything right. Elijah let out a bitter, hollow laugh. And it still didn't matter. Denise looked at him then, really looked at him. A 16-year-old kid, still sweaty from basketball practice, still carrying the weight of a moment that never should have happened. Because this wasn't just about tonight. This was about every other night, every other child, every other mother who had to sit their son down and teach him how to survive in a world that saw him as a threat before it ever saw him as a person. And across the neighborhood, in the dim glow of her living room, Linda sat staring at her phone. The same phone she had used to call 911. The same phone that, in another version of this story, could have been the reason Elijah never made it home. Her stomach churned, her pulse thudding unevenly. She had thought she was protecting her neighborhood. She had thought she was being careful. She had thought she was doing the right thing. But now, in the unbearable silence of her own home, she had to face the truth. She had been afraid. And for the first time she asked herself, really asked, afraid of what? Her gaze dropped to the screen in her hands. And then, another question. A question she had spent her whole life avoiding. What if the danger wasn't him? What if it was me? And now, ask yourself, how many times has a call like this ended differently? How many stories like Elijah's don't have a mother showing up just in time? How many people like Linda get to walk away, never giving it a second thought? This isn't just one afternoon in one neighborhood. This is reality, every single day. Maybe it's time we stop pretending we don't see it. Maybe it's time we stop making excuses for it. Maybe it's time we actually do something about it. And if this story made you pause, even for a second, then don't let it stop here. Talk about it. Share it. Learn from it. Because the next time someone like Linda picks up the phone, the person on the other end of that call might not be as lucky as Elijah.